Oh, I didn't get to see the curtain. Anyways, hi, my name is Carmen Goodman, and we're going to be doing the challenge assignment for The Sound of the Stars Make Rushing Through the Sky. In this assignment, we're going to be doing a comparison of the poem written by Jane Schoolcraft and the translations between Robert Dale and her husband. See, look at the agenda, all correct and everything. So once again, we're going to just be comparing the free versus the direct translation made by the husband and Dale today in our agenda. And we're also going to discuss the power of word, because that's why we're here today. Jane Schoolcraft wrote a poem in her native language. I believe you pronounce it Ojibwe, and her husband made a free translation for us. And several years later, in 2005, Dale wrote one as well. And the comparison today is to show how different and impactful the translations are because of how they are phrased and structured in comparison to each other. History. So we're going to talk about the history just a little bit before we talk about the comparison because it's important for the context of the poems. This is the Ojibwe territories near Sainte Marie. Okay, so the history. There was a shift in society at this time. The Europeans' arrival caused a big disturbance in land ownership and pretty much just government in general. In the early 19th century, there was a massive shift of power and culture for the indigenous people because of the Indian Removal Act. The 5 great nations were moved from their ancestral lands, as you can see in the map, to different areas as reservations. They had a loss of sovereignty as well because there were a lot of laws and treaties and acts at the time that undermined their authority and rights of people and land they had, so it got taken away. Also, there was a shift in roles and values at the time as Christianity was being pushed still, and the way people viewed and valued things were different. We were doing a bigger shift to the Western views than before. So this is where we're going to get into comparison of the poem, selective phrasing, word choice, and sentence structure. Okay, so for her husband's version, it was written in a more formal European Romance fashion, customary for the Western 19th century time frame. It was a lot more like I was reading a story at the time because that's just how he wrote it. He added in a lot more sentimental imagery describing the land's beauty and using a lot of metaphors. It was more like he made a localization than a translation, as one would do like a song that had to come from Mandarin from English. It wasn't really a translation of sorts because he wrote it in how he thinks his customaries would probably have wrote it. The tone was also more like a bitter farewell. There was a lot more remorse to it and sadness. And it was written in a more proper, for Western standards, grammar and sentence structures. It was versus the direct translation made by Robert. Jane was more direct and brief in the way she wrote her poem, and her tone was more of a restricted sorrow. It was sad, but in a way it was needed, and it was more of a quote-unquote broken sentence structure because of her straightforward way of writing. The differences in meaning. The poem presented in a way that gives off different impressions, mostly due to these 3 factors: the cultural framing, the history, the perspective of the mother, also how he viewed she would feel versus how she actually felt, and tone, which goes more into the sad but needed, bittersweet sorrow frame. For cultural framing, Henry's version added in details that weren't even the main focus of the original poem. Her poem was strictly about the leaving and why they were leaving. There was no mention of the indigenous loss of land or describing the beauty or even the arrival of Europeans. Henry's version added a lot more political details that were not in the original poem. This is where we get into the big portion. Why the difference is here, and we can break it down really into these four main things. As said before, because it's a free translation, there was a lot of things added and expanded idea-wise that are woven into the original text. Again, he added a lot more imagery talking about the beauty of the land and how Western culture was coming in, and it was just there. While her direct translation had actually no mention of it whatsoever. His colonial views and values influenced how he wrote the poem as well. He wasn't exactly impartial. That's why there was also a very big bias in the way he wrote his. It sounded like a necessary sacrifice. If you didn't understand the poem was about their children being sent away. Well, in a weird stance. And it was a necessary sacrifice. He didn't view it as a tragic loss or something. Even though he wrote his a little bit more dramatic, it was a necessary sacrifice. Also, he was writing it for English speakers, and English speakers at the time, oh, that's a typo. I'm sorry. I just saw that, 1 to the 7. English speakers expect poems to be styled a certain way, like the romantic poem setting, while in the Dale's version, nothing was added, nothing was taken. And I feel like the big thing that's the difference here is Jane was a storyteller. In their culture, the way they express history and lessons is through storytelling. So the way they give out the information is very restrained and concise. It's not as dramatized and long-winded as you would see a typical 19th century story be. Her view on the situation was like an unavoidable loss. It was restricted. It wasn't, oh, poor me. It was more like it was sad, but she couldn't stop it. Oh, you can't really see the last bit, but I'll just tell you. She didn't even have an audience in mind. She was a storyteller, and she was not going to conform to a Western literary norm when writing this poem. And that's it. The main differences I saw, the main thing that I noticed in this story is how totally different it was. At first, I didn't even think I was reading the right poem because I was like, this is no way this is the correct poem. Because it's amazing how it's the same, not the same, from the same source, but gives off two entirely different tones and vibes where I was questioning where was he coming from? Because the mention of the leaving was so brief that I just mainly focused on the imagery that was presented to me, while hers was sweet and direct. Oh, I was just saying, my land, west is far, it must happen. It was it was just very different and jarring to see that difference presented. Thank you for listening to my comparison and meaning, and I hope I was able to get across the difference in the poems. Thank you.